you ready for this? All right, let's get started. Micro Unit 1, Screencast 1. The unit is called the economic problem. The screencast is called the nature and method of economics. Basically a background for what you need to know to really get started with economics. I'm going to be talking relatively quickly in these screencasts, but remember you can rewind if you don't understand something, or you can come in and ask me questions. That's what they pay me the big bucks for. So let's get started. It's probably first important to distinguish between what is called microeconomics and what is called macroeconomics. Now, microeconomics is about individual units in the economy. It's about one person, one company, one industry. What should I do? What should GE do? What should the orange industry do? What's the state of things for those individual units? It's basically the first semester of the course, and in college it would be a separate class called microeconomics. Macroeconomics is about everyone taken together. It's about the entire economy, the nation as a whole. What's going on with the United States, what's going on with China, that kind of stuff. That's going to be the second semester of the course, and also in college it would be a separate course called macroeconomics. Now the economics curriculum is kind of nice because at the end of the year you'll have the opportunity to take two separate AP exams, one in micro and one in macro. That could get you 2 college classes worth of credit if you follow along well, which I know that you're going to do. All right, one other distinction before we get started, the distinction between what's called positive and normative economics. Now, positive economics are statements of fact. So, for example, if I say to you the unemployment rate is 8%, or if I say to you that our GDP is $15 billion, those are positive economic statements. Can't really argue with those. They're based on fact. Normative economics are statements of opinion or of what ought to be. If I tell you the unemployment rate is too high or our GDP is too low, those are normative economic statements. And the reason I bring this up at the outset is because people will often try to convince you of things by hiding what are really normative economic statements, statements of opinion, as positive economic statements. We're going to have to be careful about this, especially as we analyze policies. We're going to have to really distinguish between what is a fact and what's simply opinion. So let's talk about what economics actually is. First off, it's a social science. What that means is that it's a science like biology or chemistry or physics, but it's not a hard science. It's a social science. It's a science about human beings. And that makes it a little bit more complicated than the hard sciences. In the hard sciences, if you want to try to figure something out, you go into a lab, you set up an experiment, you control for all the variables except the variable you're looking at, and you see what happens. In economics and other social sciences, it's a little bit more difficult because we're dealing with people. So for example, I might be interested in the effects of child abuse on what happens to people's incomes later on in life. If you're abused as a child, you make less money. Well, if this was physics or another hard science, I would set up an experiment. I'd get 30 babies, I'd bring them into a lab, and I'd treat them well and pat their heads and feed them. I'd get 30 other babies, and I'd just beat them incessantly throughout their entire childhoods. I'd let them both grow up, and I'd see what happens to their incomes. Now, since I have a soul and since it's illegal, I can't do those things. That's what makes social sciences a little bit more difficult. But through statistics and various subfields of economics that have names like econometrics and others, there are ways to deal with that problem and still come up with answers. It's still a little bit more difficult than the hard sciences. So it's a social science, and what it's concerned with is the efficient use of scarce resources to achieve the maximum satisfaction of unlimited human or economic wants. In other words, given our time, our money, our effort, the resources that we have, how do we go about making ourselves as happy as we can possibly make ourselves? This is why I love economics, because it's not really about money. It's about how do you become as happy as you can possibly be. And economics doesn't tell you what should make you happy. It simply tells you how to get the most of what you find brings you the most happiness. So for example, I might walk up to you and I might say, hey, you know what really brings me happiness? This. Green felt tip pens. Something about just touching these things brings me into orgiastic states of pleasure. I just can't get my hands on enough of these things. Now, economics will not tell you that you're a freak, although you are. What economics will say is, okay, given that this is what brings you happiness, And given your limited time and money and energy and etc., how do you go about getting the most of these things that you can possibly can? Now you notice that the word unlimited is underlined. And what that means is that humans are basically insatiable. If I asked you to make out a list of everything you can possibly want, and I were to give you everything on that list, I would suggest to you that it would take you a relatively short amount of time to think of one more thing that you'd want. So that's what economics is about, making humans happy, which is why I like it, because I want to be happy. Now, because it's a science, it uses the scientific method and scientific methodology. In other words, we set up experiments. We form hypotheses, questions about the world. If I beat children, will they make less money? If we cut taxes, will growth go up in the country? And we set about trying to answer those questions. Now, anytime you set up an experiment, you're trying to look at one particular variable while keeping all the other variables equal. So, for example, if my question is, will cutting taxes lead to more economic growth? I have to control for every other variable that might lead to economic growth. Education, better health care, technology. That's what ceteris paribus means, keeping everything else equal. So my question really is, if I cut taxes, ceteris paribus, keeping everything else equal, will the country experience more economic growth? Got to keep that in mind because often people don't think about those other variables that tend to affect things. Now, to do economics, since we can't just bring babies into labs, we form models. And a lot of the models are going to be in the form of graphical expression, graphs. Graphs are really important in economics, and models are really important. So for example, if I said to you, what's time? Tell me what time is. You might point to a clock, and you might say, that's time, it's 2 o'clock. Well, when I look at the clock, I don't really see time. I see plastic, I see metal, I see little hands, maybe some springs. The clock isn't time. The clock is a model for our concept of time, which is actually much more complicated. Well, same thing with economics. We're going to take complicated concepts and put them into models, typically graphs, to try to simplify them and understand them a little better. Just because an actual physical clock isn't time doesn't mean that a clock can't tell me a lot about what time actually is. All right, so let's talk about that concept of scarcity now. We said that economics was about the efficient use of scarce resources to make ourselves happy. Now, to economists, almost everything is considered to be scarce. Specifically, in order to be scarce in economics, two things need to be true. First off, whatever it is we're talking about has to be desirable. People have to want it. So skin cancer isn't scarce. Heart disease isn't scarce. Pain isn't scarce. Unless you're a masochist, then there are some of those out there. So if it's not desirable, we don't consider it scarce. Most things are desirable. Cars, houses, time, money, that kind of stuff. Secondly, there has to be not enough of it. And what I mean by that is that if there's even one person in the world that would like even a little bit more of something, if that thing is desirable, we're going to consider it scarce. So for example, in America, you go into a supermarket, it's hard to imagine how food might be considered scarce. There's tons of food around. But there's plenty of people in the world, and even in the United States, that would like at least a little bit more food, if not a lot more food. Food is going to be considered scarce. It's hard to really think about what wouldn't be considered scarce under these two criteria. All right, now one of the implications of scarcity is that it requires choice. Because almost everything is scarce, we have to make choices. In fact, every time we make a choice, we are necessarily giving something else up. There's a famous quote in economics, which is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Meaning that if you came up to me today and said, hey, I'll buy you lunch, I'm paying, that lunch still isn't really free. If I choose to go to lunch with you, I'm giving up something. I'm giving up whatever I'd be doing if I wasn't at lunch with you. I'd be giving up the lunch I'd be eating if I wasn't going out with you. There's a cost involved to it, to making a choice. Now, economists give a name to that cost, and they call it opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is whatever it is that you have to give up whenever you make a choice. Alternatively, You can think about it as your next best alternative. If I wasn't going out to lunch with you, what would I be doing? That's the opportunity cost. It might be money, but it might be something else too. So I'll give you a couple of examples. What would the opportunity cost be if I decide to spend $10 on a book? Well, that one's pretty easy. It'd be $10, or whatever I'd buy with that $10 if I wasn't buying that book. What would the opportunity cost be if I decide to spend time with my younger daughter and I have two daughters? Well, the opportunity cost there, or at least one of them, would be that I can't spend time with my other daughter. She might get angry. What about going to college for a year? Well, you give up the money that it costs you to go to college, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, but you also give up other things. In fact, you give up something pretty major, which is the opportunity to work full time. If you didn't go to college, you might get a job that paid $20,000 or $25,000 a year. So the cost of going to college isn't just tuition, room, and board. There's also the other opportunity costs, the $25,000 you aren't making because you've decided to go to college. It makes the expense of going to college even more unfathomably scary when you think about it in that way. What if you decide to marry your husband or wife? Well, there's an opportunity cost there, right? It's the unless you're in Utah. It's the opportunity cost of whoever you would have married if you didn't marry your husband or wife. In my case, her name's Lisa, but we'll leave that aside. All right, next concept in economics, basic concept, is the concept of utility. To an economist, everything has value, or you can place a value on pretty much anything. Now, we call the pleasure, satisfaction, or benefit you get from something quote-unquote utility. And we measure utility either in these imaginative units that we call utils, units of happiness. Alternatively, we often measure utility in dollars, since dollars are understandable by pretty much everyone. And I'm going to push you to the point that gets uncomfortable for some people, but I'm going to suggest to you that you can pretty much measure anything in dollar terms. All right, so I'll give you some examples. If I wanted to figure out in dollars how much the following were worth to you, I might go about it like this. Let's say a pen. You're holding on to a pen. I want to know how much your pen is worth to you. Well, I can perform a little experiment. I can simply walk up to you and say, hey, I'll give you a penny for your pen. You might say no. I'd say, I'll give you $100 for your pen. You'd probably say yes. Well, right off the bat, I now have a range. I now know that your pen is worth something between 1 penny and $100. And now all I have to do is narrow down that range. 2 pennies, $50, 10 pennies, $10. Soon enough, I would get you to a relatively close number for what the pen is worth to you. Now, it might not be worth the same thing at all times, right? Right before a test, it might be more useful than in the middle of the night. And it might not be worth the same thing to all people. If I have that pen fetish I was talking about, maybe I need $300 in order for me to give you this pen. But nevertheless, for each individual person, I can get them to a dollar value for a particular thing. What about something a little bit more difficult? A really good concert, an experience. Well, I'd simply perform the same experiment. Start at a penny, start at $1 million, and start working down that range. What about your pet? I used to have 2 cats that recently died, and I love them to a degree. But, what if you took your dog to the vet and your vet said, your dog has this terrible, painful disease, he's going to die a terrible, painful death. We can cure him, but it's going to cost $100,000. Well, if you're not willing to pay that $100,000, you have put a price on the life of your pet. Your pet is worth something less than $100,000 to you. And again, I can kind of go through the same kind of little thought experiment and actually get you to a number, as uncomfortable as it is, of the value of your pet that you may say you love. What about your finger, something a little bit closer to home? I want your finger. I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do with it, but I want it. Well, I can actually get you to a value for your finger. I'd simply take your hand and slap it onto a desk. I'd hover over it with like a butcher's cleaver, and I'd say to you, I am going to cut your finger off unless you give me a penny. Would you give me a penny? Well, yeah. I'm going to cut your finger off unless you give me $10 million. Well, you say, I don't have $10 million. Okay. I will cut your finger off unless you give me everything that you have now. All the stuff in your room, your car if you have one, your electronics, your clothes, you're going to be walking around naked the rest of your life, and any money you earn into the future, except for paying for gruel, which will keep you alive, I want all of that money too. And unless you give me all of that, I am cutting off your finger. Now, unless you're a concert pianist, I'm guessing that if you believe me, you might wind up giving me your finger, right? It's not worth everything else in your life. Well, what about maybe the hardest case, a human life? People say, well, a human life, it's infinitely valuable. But I'm going to suggest to you that it actually isn't. I mean, we have the death penalty. We have wars. We have armies. As soon as we have an army, we know someone's going to die. And if life was infinitely valuable, we wouldn't trade it for anything, but we do all the time. Every time someone goes to a hospital and can't afford treatment for some condition, and society doesn't pay for it, society is implicitly saying, your life isn't infinitely valuable. In fact, if you really believed that your life was infinitely valuable, you would wake up in the morning, you'd crawl out of bed, into your closet, hide underneath a pile of clothes, wait for the day to end, crawl back to your bed and go to sleep. Because you wouldn't take the risk of anything happening to your life. As soon as you get into a car, you are saying to the world, my life isn't infinitely valuable because I'm willing to take a risk with it. All right, well, how much is a human life worth? In chemicals, it's about $8. But all sorts of people have conditions in our country that would only cost a few $1,000s to treat. We as a society don't come up with that money and give it to them. We're essentially valuing their life at less than a few $1,000s. Or the worst example I can think of, this thing bothers me all the time. I was watching an infomercial, I watch infomercials, and there was one for a charity, and it said, give money to Africa. For $1, we can buy a mosquito net, and that'll save little children in Africa from malaria, which kills, thousands of kids in Africa every day. Send $1 and we can save a life. Well, if I don't send that dollar, what am I effectively valuing at least an African life as, right? I mean, I think about this all the time. I go into Starbucks and I buy a coffee for $4 and I'm drinking the coffee. And when I'm drinking it, I'm thinking to myself, wow, these are 4 delicious Africans. They're just delicious. I mean, essentially, I'm killing 4 Africans by drinking this coffee because I'm not sending these $4 to Africa to buy mosquito nets. I've effectively priced the human life at something less than $1, and I feel terrible. All right, moving on. Rational behavior and self-interest. Economists assume that people are rational, and what that means is that they try to maximize their utility. They try to make themselves as happy as possible. Economists also assume that people are self-interested, which is not the same thing as being selfish. Self-interested means you're trying to make yourself happy. Being rational means you will make choices that will lead to that outcome. So for example, if you're a terrible person and murdering people makes you happy, economists are going to assume that you will do things that lead to the murder of more people. If you're Mother Teresa and helping the poor makes you happy, economists will assume that you will do things in your life that lead to the goal of helping the poor. Now, Mother Teresa is still self-interested. She's still trying to make herself happy. What brings her happiness is helping others. Self-interest and selfishness are not the same thing. All right, well, let's try out a little thought question and see if you're actually rational. Let's say you're at a store and you're about to buy this fancy new notebook for $45. Before you buy it, your friend calls from a store that's 15 minutes away and says that they're selling the same exact notebook for $5. Here's the question. Would you drive to the other store to get the cheaper price? All right, yes or no? Now let me ask you one other question. Let's say that instead of buying a notebook, you're at a car dealership and you're about to buy a new car. It costs $20,000. Again, right before you buy it, your friend calls from a car dealership, again 15 minutes away, and says they're selling the same exact car, same color, same model, same everything, for $19,960. Again, the question is, would you drive to the other car dealership to get the cheaper price? Now, you could have said yes to both of these questions and been rational. You could have said no to both of these questions and also have been rational. But if you said yes to one and no to the other, an economist would say that you're not rational because you're not doing the thing that I'm asking you about in each question. In other words, I'm asking you the same exact question both times. Both times, the question that I'm essentially asking you is it worth it to you to drive 15 minutes to save $40? Same exact question in both situations. That's what rationality means, logically leading yourself to the right conclusions. Economists assume that people are rational. I challenge you to think about whether or not that's actually true. All right, finally, pitfalls to objective thinking. Economists assume that people are rational, they're self-interested, they're trying to maximize their utility, whatever that is for them. So these are things that lead people to think incorrectly about things and lead to them not maximizing their utility or maybe societal utility as well. First pitfall to objective thinking is called the fallacy of composition, which simply means that what's true for an individual is not necessarily true for the group the individual belongs to. I happen to know one smart football player. That does not mean that all football players are smart. That's the fallacy of composition, relatively basic fallacy. Second pitfall to objective thinking is ignoring opportunity costs. You now know what an opportunity cost is, so I'll give you an example. Let's say there's a guy, his name is Tom. He's an independent computer programmer. Let's say he gets paid $200 an hour for the time that he works. He decides not to work his usual 8 hours on Friday, and instead he goes down to a soup kitchen and he ladles soup for the poor. Tom is feeling pretty good about himself, and my question is, should he? Now I'm going to suggest that he shouldn't feel good about himself. I'm going to suggest that he should actually feel bad about himself. Because there's an opportunity cost for Tom of going down to the soup kitchen and ladling soup. The opportunity cost is what he's giving up by doing that. And specifically in this example, he's giving up about $1,600 that he could have made if he had simply been working. I would say to Tom that if you really cared about the poor, you would work on that Friday, take the $1,600 and give it to the soup kitchen. They could surely hire a lot more soup ladlers than one with $1,600. If you really care about the poor, you should be working and giving away your money. I would say that Tom's actually being selfish so that he could feel good about himself. His actions are actually resulting in less poor people, less hungry people getting fed. That would be ignoring an opportunity cost. He simply thinks he's doing something good because he's ignoring the opportunity cost of what he could be doing otherwise. All right, next pitfall to objective thinking, failing to ignore what are called sunk costs. A sunk cost is a cost that you've already paid, a cost that you can't do anything about anymore, a cost that happened in the past. And what economists say is that you should totally ignore those costs, not factor them into your thinking. I'll give you an example. Let's say you buy a ticket to a concert that costs $1,000. It's just the most awesome concert ever. On the day of the concert, you get violently ill. You're vomiting, you have a fever, you have a headache, it's terrible. You try to scalp the ticket, but for whatever reason, no one's buying it at any price. Let's say that you know with certainty that if you go to this concert, you will certainly have a worse time than if you simply stay home. Not fun to vomit at a concert, not fun to go to a concert when you have a headache because of the loud music. So the question is, should you go to the concert? Well, an economist would say no. Most people would say yes. Most people would say, hey, I paid this $1,000. I don't want it to be wasted. I'm just going to suck it up and I'm going to go to this concert or else this $1,000 is gone. What an economist would say is, nope, that $1,000 is already gone. This concert is essentially free for you. You already paid the $1,000. Now you simply have a choice to make. Go to the concert and feel really, really terrible, or stay home and just feel a little bit terrible. If you're smart, you would stay home. All right, last kind of pitfalls to objective thinking, causation fallacies. There is a difference between what's called correlation, which means that two things are connected, and causation, which means that one thing caused the other. So for example, if you live on a farm and every morning you wake up, you hear a rooster and then the sun comes up. The next day you hear a rooster and the sun comes up. The rooster and the sun are correlated. There's some connection between them. They both happen in the morning. The rooster crowing, this piece of poultry yelling out into the air, is not causing this big orb of gas to rise over the horizon, right? They're simply correlated They're not causing one another. And people get these confused all the time. They see A happen, then they see B happen, and they say to themselves, oh, A caused B. Not necessarily so. The post hoc fallacy is a specific example of this. Instead of describing it, I'll just give you my favorite example. Every year on the day of the Super Bowl, sewer systems around the country back up, and sewage flows out of sewer systems. Happens every Super Bowl. You could read about it in some local paper somewhere pretty much every year. So what's going on? Well, 22 guys running around a field isn't causing sewer systems to back up. Can you think of what is? The Super Bowl is pretty much the only day in America where everyone in America goes to the bathroom at exactly the same time. Because people are watching the Super Bowl, they wait for the commercial, and then once the commercial happens or halftime happens, that's when they go to the bathroom. Well, our sewer systems weren't designed for half of the people in America to flush at exactly the same time. Again, this is a specific example of correlation versus causation. 22 guys running around a field and sewer systems backing up are correlated. But what's causing those sewer systems to back up is everyone flushing at exactly the same time. So the post hoc fallacy is exactly that. Just because A happens and then B happens doesn't mean that A caused B. All right, we're going to wrap the first screencast up there. The rest will go kind of like that. Some will be more complicated, some may be less. And again, if you have questions, let me know.
All right, so here is the chicken you'll be enjoying tonight.
You have this information. This is fantastic.
Absolutely. His name was Colin. Here are his papers, okay?
That's great.
He looks like a happy little guy who runs around.